Med school doesn't have to be so hard, and I'm here to tell you that you can be a med school weapon and achieve all of your goals in 2025. My name's Emil, and I've managed to get high distinctions and win an award in medical school, all while playing sports, music, doing multiple committees, having a social life, and running this YouTube channel. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying any of this to brag, but because I know I'm not special. The reason I've been able to do this is because of help from my peers, YouTube videos like this one, online courses, and years of trial and error. So in this video, I'll share with you all of the tips that will make you a med school weapon this year. Let's start by talking about the fastest way to learn new information that will completely transform how you study. The problem in med school is that there's so much information to learn and everyone seems to be using a different way to study. People tell you different study tips all the time, and it's really hard to know what works and what doesn't. Even worse, trying something that doesn't work has a huge risk, which is that it could be a complete waste of time. This is why understanding how our brains learn information is so important, and I'm going to share it with you so that you can make your own choices about how you want to learn. So, how do we actually remember information? Well, there are multiple models that explain memories, but the one I'll talk about today is called the Multistore memory model. This explains that we have 3 different types of memory. The first is the instant memory we have of things that are coming in through our senses, like sight and sound. This is known as our sensory register. The thing is, we obviously don't remember everything that comes in through our eyes, because that would just be overwhelming. This is where the second type of memory comes in, which allows us to remember and work with a limited number of things when we pay attention to them. This is called our short-term memory. From here, we can think about things and create structures based on what is most meaningful, which lets us transfer information into our long-term memory. Understanding how information moves between these types of memory is a secret that will let you study so much faster. Most med school tips focus on active recall, which is about retrieving information once it's already in your long-term memory. But these tips don't actually address the other half of the equation, which is the process of getting information into your long-term memory in the first place. So how do you do this properly in practice? Well, information comes into your brain all the time through your sensory register. When you pay attention to it, it moves into your short-term memory, and then it moves from your short-term into your long-term memory through a process called encoding. So, how do you encode properly? Well, put simply, you need to think critically about the information that's coming in. But what does this mean? The way that most students would write notes, it would be by writing lists of things they have to remember, like the risk factors, symptoms, investigations, and management. But the thing is, good encoding involves thinking about the information more deeply than just the level of a list. This means thinking about why symptoms occur, why certain investigations are done, and what patterns you might notice in the way that a condition is managed. This is really hard to do while you're typing, so I encourage you to get a blank piece of paper or use an iPad to work in all directions, creating as many connections as you can. As you get better, you can start thinking about what connections are the most important, and then you can start thinking about multiple conditions at the same time. So instead of studying one condition like AMI, you can study all of the different causes of chest pain and compare them between each other. It is true that this can take more time at the start, but when you have good encoding, information stays in your long-term memory for much longer, which means that you don't need to review it as often. Thinking about information critically also means that you have much stronger fundamentals, which means that you're much less likely to get stumped by questions. Now that you know this, you also know that if you learn about any studying technique at all, you can think to yourself, is this helping me encode, or is this helping me maintain my long-term memories? And from there, you can decide whether it's something that you want to do or not. This leads us to talk about the maintenance of long-term memories, which is done through retrieval. But there are a lot of problems with the way that med students do retrieval that hold them back. Most medical students I see use Anki and practice exams for active recall and spaced repetition. These are definitely effective, but the problem with them is that they're inherently limited by the question on the flashcard or the practice question that you get given. Anki is most effective when asking about one specific fact, and practice exams usually test one key concept or fact as well. If you think about it logically in this way, they can't possibly be the most effective way to study, because memorizing every fact one by one isn't feasible, and you can't possibly answer every single practice question to exist either. Med school exams can test you on so many different variations of content, and questions might ask you to find a diagnosis, infer management, or identify the best investigation. They might also ask you about the side effects of management, the side effects of investigations, or contraindications to investigation. There's so much content that it's impossible to memorize it all, but there are solutions that can let you memorize this content much faster. and they take less time. The first solution is to use mind map brain dumps. This means writing down everything you can remember and trying to form a bigger picture structure in the process. This is the same kind of process that you do with encoding, thinking about the best way to approach the topic that you're studying. For example, if you do a brain dump on respiratory conditions in pediatrics, you could think about the different conditions and which ones cause which symptoms. You can think about which ones cause upper respiratory problems versus lower respiratory problems, and you can consider how that would influence the symptoms the child is likely to have. In this process, you'll realize that there's a lot of stuff that you don't know, and this is exactly what you want. Stuff you don't know in your revision is stuff that the assessors could have tested you on and that you would have gotten wrong. The second solution is to use teaching as a retrieval method. You can find someone to teach, form a study group, or even just pretend to teach an imaginary person. Teaching requires a deep understanding of the content, and to make it even harder, I encourage you to avoid using definitions. What this means is that instead of saying heart failure causes orthopnea, you would explain heart failure can cause shortness of breath when lying down, which is called orthopnea. A level further from that would be to avoid using the term heart failure entirely, and to explain the underlying process that causes the shortness of breath when lying down. Anki and practice questions absolutely still have their place, but revising content like this will let you get through much larger amounts of content in less time. But being a true med school weapon involves having free time to do whatever you want. And the easiest way to do this is to make the most out of your class. Med school timetables are usually packed with tutorials and classes, so you can imagine how much more efficient you could be if you're able to use all of this time much faster and remember everything you learned in those classes. The thing is, we can actually understand how we can do this by thinking about how our conversations go with other people. Imagine you meet someone completely new at a party and you start having a conversation with them. We all know that it's much easier to have a conversation with someone when you have some sort of common interest. If the other person mentions that they like watching baseball, but you know absolutely nothing about baseball, it's a lot harder to continue the conversation down that path. On the other hand though, if they talk about a topic that you know at least a little bit about, you can start asking appropriate follow-up questions, and then the conversation often flows a lot better. This applies to your classes and lectures too. In my experience, if you go to a lecture or tutorial with no knowledge of the topic beforehand, it's really hard to learn anything because there's so much information and you don't even know where to start. On the other hand, if you studied a little bit about the topic before the lecture, you're able to ask appropriate follow-up questions and you can learn the information from the tutorial a lot better. This also lets you think about the information more critically and engage in the good encoding that I mentioned earlier in the video. But the part that none of this has mentioned is the mindset that you can adopt to always stay motivated in med school. It's so easy to struggle with imposter syndrome in medicine, especially when you're surrounded by people who are incredibly smart and talented. I can distinctly remember a lecture in my first clinical year where a lecturer asked a question. It was, what commonly underdiagnosed condition is also treated by spironolactone when prescribed for heart failure? If you want, take a moment to pause and think about it. But at the time, I was relatively early on into my clinical years and I had no idea what the answer was. But one of my friends actually answered it correctly. And the answer is Conn's syndrome, also known as primary aldosteronism. I know that now, but I can remember at the time thinking that I didn't even know how my friend had possibly learned that. And I was feeling like I was so far behind them. And in general, I feel like this is kind of representative of your journey through medicine. It's filled with these moments where no matter how much you seem to study, you get humbled and realize that you still have so much left to learn. It can be really discouraging. As time has passed though, I feel that I've been able to deal with this feeling much better. And it's by recognizing that everyone is playing their own game. When you're in situations like the one I just described, you're encouraged to compare yourself with other people and to view yourself negatively because you happen to know less than them. And the truth is, when someone's able to answer a question that you weren't able to, they know more about that topic than you do. There's no way to get around that truth. But what's also true is that there's no need to apply a moral judgment onto the fact that they know more than you. I find that we often make these moral judgments, like for example, oh, they know more about this than me and that's bad, because we compare ourselves to others unfairly. Thing is, they might know more about the topic because they've studied the topic more, or it could be because they revised it the day before, or because they were asked the same question by a consultant last week. The reason they might have studied the topic more could be because getting high grades is really, really important to them. It's impossible to know what other people are prioritizing, and you never know how much they might have sacrificed to get to the point that they're at. And the result is that inherently, if you make a comparison between yourself and someone you don't know everything about, the comparison will be unfair because you're likely to assume positive things about their lives rather than negative ones. You're more likely to assume that they work much harder than you and that they do a ton more extracurriculars. You're very unlikely to assume that they might have had to sacrifice a ton of things in order to get to the place that they are at now. The only person that you can actually know everything about is yourself. And as a result, the only truly fair comparison you can make is a comparison with yourself. Changing your mindset in this way is, in my opinion, one of the most important things to become a med school weapon. It's very hard, but you can learn to play your own game and start just aiming to beat your own personal records. If you feel like your level of knowledge is not up to your personal standards, that's okay. And you can do something to improve it. If you feel satisfied with the amount you've learnt, then that's okay too. And you can think about how you can improve yourself in other areas of your life. But the thing is that everything you've learned here will be completely useless if you don't know how to improve your studying system. So watch this video to see how I manage my life in medical school with my complete productivity system.